Imagine yourself sitting in a classroom. The teacher is droning on about a series of decisive battles in World War I, complete with dates and geographic locations. You feel like you want to chew off your arm. You're actually imagining that you're me in my world history class in high school. I was a smart kid, I was good at school, and I did well in this history class. But I hated every last second of this experience. And after I finished the required history courses in my high school curriculum, I did not think about history, ancient, contemporary, or for that matter, current events that will become our history, until at least a decade later. At that point, I discovered that there was an entire world of history out there that dealt with fascinating questions, at least to me, like how did we come to think about child rearing the way we currently do? Or how did people with minority sexual identities and orientations manage in historical and cultural eras that differed from our own in openness? I made use of my limited free time to read actual books on these historical topics. Well, what on earth is different about these two situations? Well, obviously, one thing that's different is I had changed. But was it simply that I don't want to learn the military history, but I do like social and cultural histories? Were there other reasons that my experiences in these two circumstances are so different? And you've likely had experiences like this one yourselves, where something that was boring suddenly seems quite interesting. So far in this course, we've assumed that we have some reason to learn and some reason to be focused on the process of learning more narrowly, and we haven't thought very much about why we learn something or whether the why of our learning might actually matter for how we learn and how well we learn. And even in the last lecture, we didn't really consider how people feel about learning. Rather, we thought about how they feel while engaged in learning. How people feel about learning, whether they experience it as something they want to do or as something they have to do, can vary quite a bit. And in this lecture, we'll consider how those motivations influence the learning of material over time, and we'll also think about how to foster the kind of motivation that helps to support learning rather than undermine it. Let's start by thinking about something that's known as self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a broad theory of human motivation, and it focuses on the importance of autonomy for human flourishing in general and for human motivation in particular. In self-determination theory, which was developed by Richard Ryan and Ed Deci some decades ago, we can think about our actions, including the actions we engage in while learning, as being on a kind of continuum from something called heteronymous to autonomous. Heteronymous actions are those that are controlled externally. They are things that we experience as being required by external circumstance. If we think about my high school experience, or indeed experiences many of us had during our formal education, we can see immediately that my experience of history learning was heteronymous. I did not, and I would not have chosen the course. I was compelled to take it by the requirements of the curriculum. The teacher chose what material would be covered and how, and he was very interested in battles and dates, and he thought they were very important. So that was the material I was required to learn. Now, there were also punishments and incentives in place. There were bad and good grades, and those were there for evaluating my learning progress and possibly intended to motivate my learning progress. Now, as I already mentioned, my experience of the class was very bad at the time, and it had some lasting effects in that I made certain to avoid ever taking a history course again. Now, on the other end of that dimension are actions that are autonomous. These are things we choose for ourselves. We choose them freely, we don't have a sense of coercion, and often they're things that are consistent with our larger goals and our sense of identity. So if we look at my current history learning activities, they fall on the extreme autonomous end of that same dimension from self-determination theory. So let me give you a concrete example. I recently read a history about the ideology of child rearing in America. Now, this is a topic that interests me deeply. I'm a parent of young children. I'm also a developmental psychologist by training, and so there's no part of my life for which the book is not meaningful. Also, nobody told me I had to read this book. I didn't actually have to read this book. Importantly, I chose to read this book. There were no tests, Nobody monitored whether I was reading the book correctly or incorrectly. I had the freedom to stop or start whenever I wanted. And I ended up reading the entire book willingly, even though some portions were actually a bit dry in the way that they were written and weren't as exciting to read. So this is the epitome of autonomous motivation. My learning behaviors were self-chosen. They were consistent with my goals, my ideals, my interests, and my identity. Now, of course, anytime you have a continuum, in this case from heteronymous to autonomous, there are in-between places on that line. One such place is called introjected. And an introjected action is linked to external concerns, concerns about what other people want or what other people need, or concerns about the rules. But in contrast to a completely heteronymous action, an introjected action is one where you can see something about why that action is necessary. Had I been somewhat older when I was in that history class, I might have experienced that learning event as more introjected. I might have been capable of reflecting on the fact that an educated citizenry needs to have a basic grasp of world history and needs to understand how our current geopolitical world arose from those historical events. Now, it wouldn't have made me joyously want to learn battles and dates, but it might have made the experience a bit less horrible. Now, another in-between place that's a bit closer to autonomous on the line is called identified. And an identified experience of an action means I've decided to do something for reasons that may be rooted in external forces, but I've thought through the action and I'm doing it because I think it's the right thing to do. So beyond introjected, where I can see why it might work, now I have committed myself in a certain sense. And you can even move a step further and you can connect the action to your overall sense of who you are and what your values are. And that makes an action what DC and Ryan term integrated rather than just identified. So why would it matter where we are on this continuum with respect to learning? Well, two important reasons are both implied with the example just seen. So first, learning for heteronymous reasons can actually feel relatively bad. And we'll say some more about a couple surprising pieces of that in a moment or two. But second, learning for heteronymous reasons actually undermines people's desire to continue to learn about a topic over the long term. And in fact, the more autonomy people report experiencing in all domains of their lives, the better they're generally doing in those domains. Learning is not an exception. So this means that a really important question is, what supports autonomy? And it turns out there are at least two aspects of learning situations that do that support a sense of autonomy. One is the ability to make meaningful choices. And to imagine an example from formal educational systems, Montessori schools typically offer preschoolers choices about learning activities. As children get older in a Montessori system, they're offered increasing opportunities to make choices about their curriculum and about their coursework. Now, by the time you become a Great Courses customer, you're exercising complete choice about your learning. Now, a second thing that supports autonomy is getting informative feedback about your progress in learning, having a sense of how well you're learning course material and where you're still struggling. Now, recall that we talked about metacognition and the monitoring of learning a couple lectures ago, and you can think about that as a kind of internal source for informative feedback. So feedback about how you're learning doesn't have to come from other people or experts in all cases. So what features of a learning situation might undermine autonomy? Well, anything that reminds us we're learning because of extrinsic forces, because the situation is compelling us to do it. So surveillance, being monitored, and being evaluated via exams and grades are ways that we can undermine a sense of autonomy, and of course being punished is ultimately undermining of autonomy. Here's the tricky thing. What about rewards? In fact, the origins of self-determination theory were actually focused on what are often called paradoxical effects of rewards on behavior. So as it turns out, rewards can really mess with intrinsic motivation. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, 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 several lectures ago you told us that rewards increase a behavior, and this seems totally at odds with what you said before. It's not quite that contradictory. Rewards work as long as they're given. What rewards don't do is to give people an intrinsic, autonomous reason to do something, including learning. So when the reward is gone, the behavior goes along with it. And in fact, rewards are even more complicated than that. Rewards for learning are often performance-based. So these are things like good grades, being on the honor roll, having a place on the demonstration dance team, and so on. And in this way, rewards do two things at once. They tell you that someone else wants you to do something, which is a problem for autonomy, but they also provide informative feedback about your learning progress, and that should be good for autonomy. So, autonomy is good for motivation. But again, rewards are external controls on behavior. Rewards are meant to encourage us to behave in specific ways. And as such, they're also kind of controlling. And that's a problem for autonomy and therefore a problem for intrinsic motivation. Now, a typical study in this area would give people a task to perform and would vary whether or not people got a reward for it. In one of the most famous examples, children were asked to make marker drawings. And this is something children often do spontaneously. They choose to do it, they get the markers and the paper, and they make drawings. But in this case, some children were actually given rewards for coloring with markers, and other kids were not. In studies of college students, they might be asked to perform some task either in exchange for a small monetary award or just to choose some task to perform for the duration of the experiment. So then, following the reward contingent part of the study, the part of the study where people did some task and got a reward for it or didn't, participants are allowed to freely choose among a variety of activities, and the variety of activities offered includes the activity that they were previously given a reward for doing. Now, study after study after study of this type shows that when you give people rewards for an activity at one time, later they're less likely to choose that activity over other options. And if they choose that activity, they don't engage in it for very long. They don't persist. The consequence of all this is that when we think about rewarding people for learning with tangible material rewards, what we're potentially doing is undermining the extent to which they later want to learn about that topic and the extent to which they're going to persist when learning about that topic. Offering people positive verbal feedback, by contrast, turns out to enhance their sense of autonomy and their intrinsic motivation to do a task. But it's really critical that this kind of positive verbal feedback or praise get offered in a non-controlling way. So educational researcher and commenter Alfie Kohn has actually written quite eloquently about how praise can get controlling and it can undermine motivation in a kind of insidious way. So what kinds of things does Kohn think it takes to make a piece of praise controlling? Well, just adding the phrase "as you should" to a statement like "you did well." But, and this brings me to my next point, we can be at least somewhat autonomously motivated by different aspects of learning. Researchers also distinguish between what are called learning goals and what are called performance goals, and you could conceivably hold both kinds of goals in an autonomous way. Learning goals are about getting better and mastering a content area. Now, by contrast, performance goals are about demonstrating your knowledge, doing very well on a test, being able to expound at the dinner table with professorial authority. Now, when researchers have looked at these types of goals and how they influence learning, performance goals often leave people vulnerable to losing motivation. If you hold a performance goal, you have to successfully achieve and demonstrate good performance in order to keep yourself motivated for longer periods of time. And if you fail at a performance, your motivation to keep learning and therefore keep performing actually suffers. This is in sharp contrast to learning for the sake of learning, that is, those learning goals. When you're learning for the sake of learning, a performance failure may be disappointing. It's disappointing to do badly on a test, but it doesn't completely undermine pursuing that broader goal of learning. And the broader goal of learning and improvement really turns out to sustain motivation pretty well in the face of failure. Now, there are some other important features of how we respond to feedback, to success and failure, and those go beyond whether our goals are oriented towards performance or learning. Some of the most interesting work in this area has been done by Carol Dweck and her collaborators, and it concerns different theories people can hold about themselves and others, and how those theories play out when we apply them to our own learning. So essentially, everyday people, we, can approach learning as a kind of revelation of our underlying intelligence, or as a process of changes that's incremental and ongoing. So, to make this a little more concrete, imagine how you might respond to the following statements on a scale that runs from "I completely disagree with this" to "I completely agree with this." You have a certain amount of intelligence and you really can't do much to change it. Your intelligence is something about you that you can't change very much. You can learn new things, but you can't really change your basic intelligence. According to Dweck, the majority of people fall into two groups: those who disagree with these statements, and she labels those people incremental theorists, and those who endorse these statements, and she terms those individuals entity theorists. So entity theorists believe that we are who we are, and incremental theorists believe that we grow and change. And you may notice right away that this likely corresponds a bit to learning versus performance goals. Now, before we move on, let's also just make a couple important points about who's an entity theorist and who's an incremental theorist. And we'll talk a little about how this material fits with what we've discussed earlier. So first, people can have incremental theories. That is, people can believe that people grow and change in, say, personality, while simultaneously having an entity theory, believing people are what they are with little chance for change, of intelligence, or vice versa. In other words, people's theories can be specific to a particular aspect of themselves rather than global across all aspects. We focused in my example items on theories of intelligence because those are the ones most tightly linked to learning. A second point is that entity and incremental theorists are often equally capable. That is, they don't differ in IQ and a host of other qualities. There are smart people who accept entity theories of intelligence, and there are smart people who accept incremental theories of intelligence. This is really important because it means if we see differences in learning between people who hold these different theories, that the differences are better able to be connected to those theory differences rather than being a function of some other ability. Now finally, as we're going to see in the next lecture, there is some evidence that intelligence is at least somewhat incremental, that it can increase under the right circumstances. So incremental beliefs may correspond better to the data we have. So what do our beliefs in intelligence have to do with learning and the motivation to learn? As it turns out, a lot. And that's mostly with respect to how people experience feedback and how feedback affects motivation. DC and Ryan showed in a review of over 100 studies that positive information about performance enhances people's motivation. We all like doing what we think we're good at. If we're learning well, we like to keep learning. But Dweck and her collaborators have focused on getting feedback about performance that is negative. In other words, they're asking what helps to maintain your motivation, to keep you going, when you actually get feedback that says, you know what, you are not doing well at this, you are doing badly. And as it happens, this turns out to depend on the theories you have about intelligence. If you are an entity theorist and you get feedback that you haven't learned something very well, let's say you fail a test, you interpret that as indicating a lack of intelligence. The problem is your ability. Well, if the problem is your ability and your ability can't be changed, what happens in motivational terms? You lose motivation because there's no reason to keep trying. The test has revealed that you're just not very capable in whatever domain you're working in. If you're an incremental theorist, by contrast, you tend to interpret the negative feedback as signaling something about your effort or your strategies, but not as telling you something about an innate, unchangeable ability. And when we think the problem is effort or strategy, we have a golden opportunity to revitalize our motivation by trying a new strategy or investing greater effort. So you'd expect, from a theoretical standpoint, that incremental theorists cope better with setbacks or initial failures and go on to do better long-term when compared with entity theorists. This is precisely what Dweck and her colleagues find. And they find this in laboratory studies of people doing tasks on a single occasion over the space of an hour, but they also find it when they follow students across school transitions in real-world learning contexts. If you believe you can learn and change over time, you will. If you believe that what you've got is not going to change, it may in fact not change. So far, we've emphasized how great it is to be autonomously motivated to learn and how much more effective and helpful it is to view intelligence and learning as incremental rather than entity qualities. But often we have to do things we don't want to do. I really couldn't just decide not to learn the military history that was required by my high school. Even for those of us who are engaged in a largely autonomously motivated lifelong learning experience, there are always moments when the material is hard, or the course turns to a topic we're just not so thrilled with. And so another question we can ask is whether there are things we can do to revitalize our own or others' motivation under these not so ideal circumstances. Now, researchers haven't fully addressed this problem, and it is a big one and an important one. And I'm going to talk about this problem in two different ways. One issue is what teachers and parents and other people responsible for getting people to learn can do. And another issue is what we can do for ourselves as individuals. So that first issue is something that Ryan and DC have begun to address. They've been working to understand how educators and parents can behave around a necessary but disliked task, so as not to undermine children's capacity to internalize that task and to sort of make the task their own, to experience a little more autonomy. So if I put it less academically, what can parents and teachers do or not do that will allow kids to become more intrinsically motivated in learning, even the tough stuff? Now, we won't fully examine this literature, but there are a few important conclusions already from it. Some of the findings really suggest that we need to avoid controlling language. And one general way you can do this is you focus on your child or your student's own happiness at having done well, or their sense of satisfaction at working hard, rather than your own pleasure that they did so. So you note for them, you're really happy, that's just great. Now, another thing you can do is you can create opportunities for meaningful choice whenever they're there. And for just one example, you can ask a child to make choices about when he or she will study or do the homework, or you can give students the opportunity to choose a particular topic to focus on for one portion of a course that otherwise requires them to learn material you've dictated. Now finally, praise and other forms of rewards, we need to be really careful about those. Lack of choice, excessive reliance on praise or controlling praise, and excessive supervision and monitoring can all delay or interfere with a kid's ability to come to autonomously engage in learning in an intrinsically motivated way. And these same issues apply to employees that you're trying to train, because we don't just stop being interested in having autonomy because we're all grown up. Okay, but I promised you that another way of asking this question had to do with how people themselves can regulate their own experiences with learning so that they can maximize their own intrinsic motivation. And here there's also some informative research for that purpose. A good bit of work from this perspective is conducted by Carol Sansone and Judith Harakowitz and their collaborators. And they argue that intrinsic motivation is there whenever people do something because they find it interesting. Now, this is totally consistent with DC and Ryan's intrinsic side of the continuum. Things we find interesting are usually going to be those where we find the task valuable, and often they're going to be things that we feel autonomous about doing. The difference from the self-determination theory perspective is that from Sansone and Harakowitz's view, a task could actually flip around on that autonomy-heteronomy continuum. That is, sometimes we might feel intrinsically motivated by a task, and sometimes that same task might leave us feeling a little bit more extrinsically motivated. And more importantly, Sansone and Harakowitz argue that we can actively move ourselves around on that continuum. We can turn play into work, and we can also, more happily, turn work into play via employing good strategies. Now, as a first step in understanding their approach, you can think about two kinds of goals that often operate simultaneously in learning: a what goal and a why goal. Listening to this lecture is part of the goal of learning about motivational factors in learning. That's the what. The why goal is your purpose in doing so, and this could vary across different people listening to this lecture. You might be listening because you're interested in understanding how learning works, and this is part of that. You might be specifically interested in understanding motivational factors, or you might be listening just because you and a friend decided to listen to the course together, and this is a way to enjoy time together. Now, from this beginning point, you then might engage in the activity, listening to the lecture, and at that point, you're going to determine if you find it interesting or not. And if you do, you probably feel like listening further and hearing more. And if not, now you have a problem. You have to figure out how to engage with this lecture in a way that's going to work for you. Or you have to decide to skip it, in which case you're not going to learn about motivation and you're not going to be hearing what I'm saying. One of the major findings from this work is that a match between the experience itself and your why goals produces stronger interest and more motivation to sustain your engagement in some activity. Now, in several studies, Sansone and colleagues have looked at people whose why goals include making social connections. And these are people that are called high in interpersonal orientation. And they're compared to people whose why goals seldom involve relationships or connections to others. So they ask these two different kinds of people to engage in an activity in the laboratory. And they're often quite interested in learning activities and learning situations. So often the task in the laboratory is an online learning task. But they then vary the conditions under which people get to do this learning task. They either get to work by themselves or they get to work with others. And then, as with many motivational studies, what they do is they look at behaviors that suggest the person's going to keep pursuing learning in that area in the future. So they look at whether people request information about related coursework at the university. So what do they typically find? Well, first of all, if the learning context, whether you're with others or by yourself, matches your interpersonal orientation, as if you're socially oriented and learning in a social context, or if you're not socially oriented and you're by yourself. Those are matching situations. And that turns out to benefit motivation. Social people like to learn with others, and relatively less social people prefer to learn by themselves. Further, if you're a non-social person, when you learn with others, your motivation takes a hit when the others engage in off-task social activity. And the opposite is true for social people who learn with others. In that case, the more off-topic socializing they do, the more they're motivated to pursue the learning activity in the future. So at the end of this tour of motivation and learning, what can we do about our own learning experiences? Well, one of the first things we can do is to try to create the circumstances that foster intrinsic, autonomous engagement with learning. And that includes trying to structure learning so that we experience meaningful choices. Maybe about topics, but also meaningful choices can be made about where and when we learn. And we also want to try to find ways to get meaningful feedback that's informative about our progress. This could include self-testing, but it can also include just trying to tell others what we're learning, because in the process of talking with others, we often acquire a clearer sense of what we do and do not understand. Another thing we can do is to cultivate a belief in incremental theories of intelligence and ability. And as we already noted, this belief is consistent with a great deal of data. So I'm not telling you to delude yourself. Rather, I'm telling you to try to see that people really can improve capabilities with practice and time. And this is about believing that this is not only true of other people, but it's also true of ourselves. Now, in the last several lectures, we've been discussing principles about learning that apply to everyone, or at least most people. So we've been acting as though who's doing the learning largely doesn't matter. But in the next section, we'll actually begin to ask whether the specific and unique characteristics of the person learning make a difference. And if so, how? We'll look at intelligence, learning styles, individual differences in interests, and finally, the role of age in learning.